Today we discuss the genetic basis of heredity. The reason we are doing this is so we can describe how traits get passed from one generation to the next, and our success criteria is being able to describe the relationship between heritability, genes, and alleles, as well as being able to differentiate between homozygous and heterozygous traits. So, genetics is the science of heredity, which is the study of variation and inheritance. Part of this is studying DNA, but it's also about determining the likelihood of inheriting certain traits from parents and predicting what inheritance patterns are going to be like in the future. It's not just about studying the physical DNA molecule itself. So what heredity does is it observes traits, the distinguishing characteristics that make individuals unique. As you might know, these traits come from genes. Genes are specific DNA sequences on a chromosome that influence individual traits. What each gene actually does is it encodes instructions to create one protein. Now, that protein might be a structural protein that directly influences the particular trait, or it might be a hormone that influences the development of particular cells, or it could be a protein that builds another chemical that's needed for a particular trait. So the gene doesn't always directly influence that one trait is going to appear this way, but it does directly influence the creation of the protein, which is what's going to determine that trait eventually. Each gene is located at a position on the chromosome known as a loci. So you can see in the diagram here that we have three particular loci, one in orange, one in purple, and one in green. And each of those loci are a different gene. The genes, you'll notice, are in the same location on the two chromosomes. So that's an important thing about genes and the way that chromosomes are built. Each homologous chromosome, so each chromosome 1 or each chromosome 2, will have the same type of information in the same location or loci. So it's the same type of gene. So the hair color genes, the eye color genes, the height, the skin color, the lactase gene will always be located in the same location on homologous chromosomes. Now, an important thing to point out is that most of us probably know that our DNA is contained within the nucleus of our cell. But this isn't actually the only DNA that we have. We also have DNA in our mitochondria. And this DNA is different from our nuclear DNA in that nuclear DNA comes from both our mother and father, but mitochondrial DNA only comes from our mothers, because we get all of our mitochondria from the mother's egg. So that DNA actually tracks strictly matrilineally. It does not get passed on by the father. The other important thing to point out about DNA is that even if a gene codes for a particular type of information, that doesn't necessarily mean that every version of that gene is identical. There are things known as alleles. What an allele is it's a variation on a gene. So for example, the differences in hair color that we see across the human species are caused by different alleles encoding for different proteins that changes the way that our hair reflects light. So that's why some people are blonde, some people have brown hair, some people have black hair, some people have red hair. Each one of them is caused by a different allele. And we can see this allele illustrated in this diagram. If you look at the green loci here, these genes are two different genes. One of them is indicated by a dark green color, and the other one is indicated by a light green color. Now, this is symbolic. They won't actually be those colors, but what it's trying to communicate is that the two alleles are different. The two chromosomes actually have two different sets of information on them. This is how we get variation within species. The different alleles have a slightly different DNA code, which means they create slightly different proteins, which can sometimes have very big consequences for us. But that creates variation, and that's why there is so much variation in sexually reproducing species, because different people are passing on different variations of the same gene. And we do have some ways to describe this as well. We can describe genes as being homozygous or heterozygous. What homozygous means, it roughly translates to same state. Homo here meaning same. Zygous actually means yolk, but we use it to mean state in biology. If a gene is homozygous, what that means is that that gene is the same at both loci within an individual. So they're both big A, or little a, okay? We often use letters to represent different gene alleles. So the capital letter and the lowercase letter represent two different alleles. So if it's homozygous, it's going to be the same allele on both of an individual's chromosomes. And if it's heterozygous, a different state, that means that it's going to be different on the two chromosomes. One might have a big A and the other one has a little a. This is how you can sometimes have a kid who has blonde hair born to two parents who both have black hair. Both of the parents were heterozygous. They were carrying, or they were showing the black-haired trait, but they were also carrying the blonde hair trait. And if the kid gets both copies of the blonde hair trait, they have blonde hair. And an important thing to know about homozygous and heterozygous states is that you can be homozygous for one gene and heterozygous for another one. It is very independent for each gene. So if an individual is homozygous for hair color, does not mean that they're going to be homozygous for another trait as well. They are independent of one another.